Thank you all for being here. Today's talk will be about understanding life in general, taking two examples as case studies about how people can deal with concepts, scientific concepts that are sometimes difficult to understand, sometimes quietly distorted. The motivation for this is the work we've been doing with the press for some years now in publishing the Understanding Life series. We have more than 20 books published as we speak, and the common thread underlying everything is the idea that these books are intended to address widely misunderstandings, and this is actually the main criterion for choosing the topics of the books. So two of these books happen to have been written by me, Understanding Evolution and Understanding Genes. These actually are books that emerged from previous editions, and it was the basic idea behind them that was also the idea behind the series. So here's an overview of my talk today. I will shortly describe what understanding life is about, and then I'm going to go through various issues related to understanding evolution and understanding genes. So I begin with understanding in general. If we think about science and what scientists do, and you see here a very nice representation of scientists working in a lab, both males and females, without the typical white robe or whatever. All these people, no matter what they're working on, they're trying to develop an understanding of the theories they're using, and then, of course, be able to use them, and then apply them to explain phenomena or make predictions about them. So in short, scientists aim at understanding theories and then use them to understanding phenomena. But this is not what non-experts, lay people do. For lay people to understand life, to understand the topics related to life, in our case, there are two conditions. The first one, as research in psychology, the psychology of learning, reveals, is that we need to address widespread misunderstandings. These stem from various sources and do not necessarily have to do with the way people perceive phenomena. They also have to do sometimes with deeply held intuitions that make scientific concepts seem counterintuitive. This is the case for evolution, I will explain shortly. They also have to do with distortions of concepts, as in the case of genes. So what we need to do is to address all that explicitly and reflectively, and then provide a basis for them to understand scientific concepts and theories, and of course, the explanations and predictions of phenomena that stem from them. So in short, understanding for non-experts is a bit different than understanding for scientists, but in both cases, we need to have a good grasp of theories, concepts, explanations, and predictions. So with that in mind, let's begin with evolution, which I describe here as a counterintuitive idea. Let us see why. If I ask you, why do birds have wings? I'm pretty sure that your spontaneous response would be in order to fly. And you see this eagle here flying. But if I showed you this picture, what would you say? You would likely say, in order to swim, because penguins do not fly. And if I showed you this picture, then you would have to stop for a minute and think, why in the world does this ostrich has wings for? Because they neither swim, nor they fly. Now, if I ask you the same question about airplanes, I don't think you would hesitate to tell me that they have wings in order to fly, no matter what kinds of airplanes I would show you. So, what is the difference in these two cases? Why we can say for all kinds of airplanes that they have wings in order to fly, but we cannot say that for all kinds of birds, even though this is the response that comes to mind intuitively? The answer, and this is actually a main argument in my book, is that there are two crucial differences between organisms and artifacts. The first one is that organisms are not intentionally designed, whereas artifacts are. We designed planes in order to fly so that we could use them for this purpose. In contrast, birds were not designed to fly. The capacity to fly is an evolved property, that has a specific history. The second idea is that the second difference is that organisms do not have fixed essences, whereas artifacts do. What does this mean? It means that the plane will always be a plane, even if we put it in a museum or elsewhere, and it will always have wings in order to fly. This is not the case for birds, which can evolve and actually have evolved to use their wings for swimming or for other purposes. Now, the interesting problem is that research in psychology shows that people more often than not think exactly the opposite. They think that organisms were intentionally designed, perhaps by God, perhaps by nature, and that they have fixed essences. And this is the problem that we have to deal with in understanding evolution, and this is what makes evolution a counterintuitive idea. There's a lot of research that shows that people generally think that whenever an organism needs something, like this animal here that is asking for a chainsaw, it is going to get it if there is a need, especially if there is sufficient time. Give people time and anything is possible, because they think that some external factor, nature perhaps, it doesn't have to be God, will satisfy the need and will support the organism in its struggle for survival. People also think that sometimes animals, especially animals, are intentional in the changes they undergo. You see here the representation of this idea with animals reading books like How to Avoid Natural Selection, Dare to be Nocturnal, Do It by Instinct. Last but not least, people tend to think of organisms in the same way they think of machines, as if they were designed and have parts to perform specific functions. And of course, it is absolutely legitimate to think that we have parts to perform functions, but the big difference is that these parts are not designed. Now, the common aspect in all these ideas about the need, about intentionality, about design, is that it comes naturally to the way we think. And sometimes it is enhanced by the metaphor scientists use, as in these two cases where the authors describe natural selection as the blind watchmaker or a tinkerer, that in the latter case, someone that finds things there and tries to make something out of them. These personifications, these anthropomorphic descriptions of natural selection, however, do not help. Even natural selection itself is a bad metaphor. So we have to deal with problems that have to do with how exactly evolution works. The second problem has to do with its relation to religion. Oftentimes, people think that there is a clear dichotomy between evolutionary theory and whatever religion, especially Christian religion, tells us. And Christian religion takes a priority here because it was in its context that the theory was developed. And we see sometimes in the media descriptions of evolution wars or oppositions of God versus science. And there are people who complain about the teaching of evolution in schools with arguments such as evolution is a theory, using the word theory in its colloquial meaning, a hypothesis, a hunch, whereas the word theory in science has a very, very different meaning, a collection of models of principles that is used for understanding, for explaining, for predicting. There are polls that sometimes seem to reveal the dichotomy. As you can see here, in more religious countries, the acceptance of evolution is lower. But actually, if you look at these polls, what happens there, the whole image is a lot more, the whole picture is a lot more complicated, and this dichotomy, it is just a superficial feature. The big problem here doesn't have to do with personal religion, with what people believe, because no one would complain about people's beliefs. The big problem has to do with the attempts of specific groups of people who accept what is in recent years has been described as intelligent design, and their argument that this is a scientific theory that should be taught along evolutionary theory in science classes. So the real problem that we have to deal with sometimes is that a pseudo-scientific theory is described as an alternative to the scientific theory. And this is something that we have to resolve in public schools. Now, with all that in mind, let us see how we can understand evolution and see what happens. The best thing to show to people, and the first thing to understand, is that organisms are not perfectly adapted. In documentary films, we often see animals like the one you see on the right here, which are perfectly concealed with color in their environment, and we think that they have done this in the same way that the soldier on the left chose the clothes he put on to be concealed. But this is not the case. This is not an intentional concealment, and also this is not the case for all organisms living in the same environment. As you can see on the right, on the left, animals may not necessarily have the same color with the background, even though they may have other adaptations. So the key point here is to realize that organisms are not perfectly adapted. If I ask you why these two whales have hydrodynamic shapes, it would be legitimate to tell me that, to answer that, they have that shape in order to swim fast underwater. And this would be the case too for these orcas. Now, in a documentary film I used to show to my students when I was a school teacher, we see these two orcas attacking the mother and the baby, trying to separate the baby, and eventually they push it down in the water until it drowns. And whereas the baby has a hydrodynamic shape to swim fast underwater, it doesn't have gills to breathe underwater. It has lungs because it's a mammal. And here is a situation of conceptual conflict that can make people reconsider their beliefs about perfect adaptation. Some organisms have specific features that are helpful, but it's not necessary that all their features are helpful. And it is only when we begin to realize that this is the case that we can understand evolution. And why is that like this? Why some features are helpful and others are not? Because they are the outcome of a history, an evolutionary history that was driven by contingencies and not by design. So, if we ask why these beetles have, which had initially green and brown colors, ended up being in a population with brown beetles only, the spontaneous response that students and people give is that because of need, plan, purpose, design, the green ones were transformed to brown ones so that they can survive. But this is an unnatural explanation because individuals cannot change during their lifetimes to adapt. Adaptation is a property of populations, and the way that it happens, it's a natural one. And a classic example is that we can have natural selection whereby we have predators that can spot the green ones more easily than the brown ones, eventually eat them and leave none of them. So the population adapts not because the individuals have changed, but because some individuals died out and others who were more appropriate in terms of their properties for the environment managed to survive. Evolutionary theory is, and its conclusions, is supported by all kinds of evidence that we have available today, be it comparative anatomy, cell biology, molecular biology, developmental biology. And there is no single argument or point in this, or a single piece of evidence that contradicts the theory. If it were, scientists would be the first to bring it up and discuss it. So one thing to have to keep in mind is the importance of history and understand that what we have today is the outcome of a long historical process. And I like the famous metaphor by Stephen Jay Gould, who said once that if we replayed life's tape, it's not necessary that humans would exist again. It's not necessary that everything would be the same, because evolution has many different paths it can take. And depending on which path is taken at each turning point, then we can have different possible outcomes. So, for instance, to give a simple example, if we have an initial population with different colors of organisms, in a particular environment, there could be natural selection, or because of a forest fire, there could be random drift. Some happen to be the ones that survived without selection, or there could be no change at all. So initially, sometimes it is very difficult to predict what will happen, and this is why evolution is unpredictable. But once things happen, we can explain what was the case. And the point here is that we usually look at the actual outcomes of evolutionary history without realizing that there are many more possible unrealized outcomes. And the key for understanding evolution is that instead of looking back in hindsight, we need to try to make ourselves part of the history and realize the different paths that life could have taken. So evolution is not random. Evolution is based on natural processes, but the critical events, turning points that have driven its path where we are today. And this is why organisms have both adaptations and features that are useless and sometimes harmful for them. Returning to religion, sometimes people also think that all scientists are atheists and against religion, but we have now evidence, no matter what we believe, and I personally see a conflict with religion, but I cannot ignore the evidence that in systematic studies, for instance, like this one in the United States, about half of the scientists interviewed were affiliated with religion. And in a broader study with more scientists from different kinds from different countries, the researchers found that there are more religious scientists than commonly thought. The majority in Italy, Turkey, India, Taiwan, and 1/3 in the United States, in the UK, France, and Hong Kong. Atheist scientists generally respect religion and understand the need of people to believe. And most importantly, the idea that religion and science must conflict is primarily an invention of the West. This is something that we do not see all over the world. So the relation between science and religion is complicated, and we cannot say that there's a conflict, a dichotomy, when many scientists find common grounds and can accept both. Which leaves the problem with what we teach in schools. And again, as I said earlier, the question is not what people believe, but what we teach in biology classes. And I take here some examples from a debate between Ken Ham, a creationist, and on the right, and Bill Nye, the science guy, on the left. And here is how Ken Ham presented the debate, that evolution and creation have the same source of evidence, the natural world, and that eventually it is just two different thinking systems that give a battle over the same evidence. Some interpret it as evidence for evolution, and some interpret it as evidence for creation. But this is not at all the case, because the ways of reasoning are different. And these two differences are very nicely represented in this cartoon, where scientists ask, here are the facts, what conclusions can we draw from them? And the creationists ask, here is the conclusion, what facts can we find to support it? If you analyze the two reasoning ways, you will see an important difference. In the creationist case, we begin with a conclusion, we find data to support it, and the conclusion, of course, is that God created the world, the natural world as we see it, and using the background theory, whatever religion the Bible tells us, we turn this to evidence that supports the conclusion. But the problem here is that we have reached the conclusion, we're not open to anything else, and we just find data to support it. This is not at all what scientists do. Scientists find data that interpreted in a specific theoretical framework becomes evidence, and then we can have different conclusions. Scientists may even debate among themselves what exactly is going on, and then they look for additional data to support one of the possible conclusions. So the key issue here is that we have different habits of mind, and this is something important to remember. So as we're not talking about using the Bible as the biology textbook, we're also not talking about using science textbooks in religious classes. And this is the distinction we can make, because these are different kinds of knowledge. If we decide to be rational and follow science to understand the natural world, not much beyond that, because natural science cannot study the supernatural, then we're good. And we should not then allow for anything outside it be taught in science classes. In religious courses, of course, people can teach whatever they believe is useful and interesting. And to give another example, in the United States, there were stories about stickers put on textbook, like the one you see here, that used to say that this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And a journalist contacted Ken Miller, who's a cell biologist and also very religious, and asked him about this. And whereas perhaps he was hoping that he would react being frustrated, he suggested that he agrees with the sticker and actually did not take it far enough. And his suggestion would be to add a new sticker saying that this textbook contains material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. So whenever we see that there may be a conflict between science and religion, if we look carefully, sometimes this ends up being a conflict about what science is and how science is done, what in science education we describe as nature of science. And having said that, we should keep in mind that science cannot and should not have answers to all questions, and that all of us who are scientists, but also everybody else, should question the scientific, not the scientific facts, but the arguments of science at any point, in the sense that, of course, when scientists say something, we should trust them because they know what they're talking about. But also, this doesn't mean that we're not allowed to question them. And actually, it is scientists themselves that question what they're saying in the first place. With that, let us then turn to what happens with genes. Why am I writing that this is a widely distorted concept? Because the way it is presented, the concept is presenting in the media, is exaggerated about the powers of a gene and what genes can do. So you see here a program in CNN some years ago talking about the star gene and about famous actors like Kirk Douglas and their famous children, Michael Douglas here, or Jon Voight and Angelina Jolie, and how things go from generation to generation. Of course, it's never that simple. It is not how things work. We have, of course, Donald Trump, who has been repeatedly tweeting about his powers and his capacities, attributing all of these to his great genes. We have had films that have been imagining utopic worlds where the power to analyze DNA would give us immense choices. For instance, selecting the specific features of our offspring, as it was suggested in the Gattaca. Luckily, we're not doing that, and it seems very unlikely that we will ever be able to do that because of the complexities of development. Other films like Blade Runner emphasize the fact that we are made based on a code, and the lady you see here, who is not a human, talks to a man and says, mere data make a man, A and C and T and G. These are the bases that constitute DNA, the alphabet of you, all from symbols. I'm only 2, 1, and 0. But again, this is very simplistic in order to describe how development works. We have other series like CSI that put too much emphasis on DNA evidence. And as they say, we're crime scene analysts. We're trained to ignore verbal accounts and we just look at evidence. And they make DNA so important so that if we find a trace of DNA, we can just analyze it, poof, we will have the image of the criminal on the screen. If only it was that simple. Of course, you may have seen some cold cases being resolved thanks to DNA, but these are very specific cases. DNA can be useful, but the point is that it cannot have all the answers. And then we move to behavior. As these journals here say in these articles, if you have a happy marriage, it could be to your genes. It's in your genes, we see on the left. Gene could be secret to a happy marriage. And if you don't have a happy marriage, if there is infidelity, again, this could be in your genes. So a good relationship can be due to genes. A bad relationship can be due to genes. And if you don't have any relationship at all, don't worry, because love is no coincidence, and we can match people by analyzing their DNA. These may seem exaggerated, but these exist on the internet, and it is easy for them to confuse people by exaggerating the power of genes. And then we have DNA tests for all kinds of things. I find very interesting the so-called DNA warrior gene test here, where they analyze a specific gene related to an enzyme which has been related to aggression. And they say that, well, you can take the test and see if you have the specific allele, a version of the gene, and understand why you have an aggressive behavior. And actually, there was a case in Italy where a murderer was given a lighter sentence because he was found to have the specific version of this MAO gene. And as the cartoon described it on the left, he would claim that it's not him, my genome made him do it. But it's not as simple as that. Nevertheless, legal scholars argue that having such evidence from DNA can tell us where to invest for future programs. And instead of building prisons, we can do screening programs and find early interventions for people who carry these genes. But clinically and medically, the picture is not that clear. And this is the study from which this was based that shows that, the people that had the low activity of the enzyme, of the protein, and also had been maltreated in childhood, had higher chances to be more aggressive. And this was interpreted as, this was inferred from the problems they had with the law. But I think that it's more interesting to see also that the people who were not maltreated did not have any problems with the law. So the question is, why look at the genes and not at maltreatment during childhood? And then we have disease. There was a famous story with Angelina Jolie, whom we saw earlier, and her decision to do a double mastectomy to avoid the risk of developing breast cancer. And this might have been a good decision for her, given her family history, but this does not mean that all women should consider these options. Of course, getting rid of a tissue that might develop cancer is a way to avoid that cancer, but we cannot know what other risks the surgery brings in and how likely it is for people to have problems with a specific gene, the BRCA1 and 2. And we have journals presenting these stories that moms with BRCA breast cancer gene mutations face tough decisions, women like Angelina Jolie should have their ovaries removed, etc., etc. And then we have stories like these, puzzle of 7 sisters who have all had breast cancer and tested negative for BRCA genes. Why? Because BRCA genes are not the only ones associated with breast cancer. And because, more broadly, the situation is a lot more complicated than that. And then we have books that describe, for instance, specific properties and features like the biological sex as the result of a single gene, or even worse, books that say that parents matter, schools matter, and life experiences matter, but nothing matters as much as DNA, because DNA is the only thing that makes a substantial systematic difference, accounting for 50% of the variance in psychological traits. They say that the differences among people can't be due to differences in DNA, but this does not mean that at the individual level, something is more or less genetic. Most importantly, and this is something that many people are not aware of, a recent studies has shown that in many countries, as you can see here, with the exception of Italy and United States, more than 50% of the people who participated in this study were unfamiliar with DNA, genetic, and genomics. So we have all these distortions of what genes can and cannot do, while at the same time, many people are not familiar with the terms. And this is where we end up, feeling that our DNA is our fate and that everything is determined there. It is not. It can be for some cases, several cases of inherited disease, which are rare, but it's not the case for most of our traits and most of our behaviors. So to understand genes, we have to think differently. In schools, we still teach about mental, and we'll still teach a very simplistic account about alleles for traits, about alleles that determine one or the other color, even though already in 1902, Raphael Weldon had shown that the peas that Mendel studied were not green or yellow, but that there was a continuum from one color to the other. What happened in the case of Mendel was that he ended up having pure varieties. He had developed a model system, but this does not mean that this is how the variation we find in nature is like. Worse than that, even today we teach at school simplistic models of inheritance, saying, for instance, that blue eyes are recessive and brown eyes are dominant, and that two parents with blue eyes will only have children with blue eyes, even though there are studies from 1909 saying that, no, this is not the case. It is possible for people with blue eyes to have a child with brown eyes. Most importantly, blue and brown are not the only colors we find in human eyes. There's a variation of colors because this is not a monogenic trait, it's a polygenic trait. So the problem with these simplistic models is that they ignore the complexities of development. And this is something very important to keep in mind. Along the way, we have seen throughout the 20th century two major gene concepts. Initially, those that are not specific about what is referred to by the term gene, a factor that controls a trait, and later, after the 1950s, those which were more specific, talking about DNA sequences or DNA segments responsible for the production of a protein or another molecule. And the typical representation we find in school textbook is this one, and we may think that this concept can be reduced to this concept, but this is not the case. And let me show you why this matters. If we have a switch and a lamp, we can have light. If the lamp is broken or the switch is broken, then there will be no light. The molecular gene that produces the protein can only be in the lamp, but the factor that can be related, not controlled, but related to a trait can be either here or here. Why? Because they're genes directly related to traits, because they produce proteins that are involved in whatever happens in our bodies, but there are also several others that control the expressions of these genes. So, whereas we tend to talk about genes for traits, this is not how things work. We do not have gene 1 for trait 1, gene 2 for trait 2, gene 3 for trait 3, etc., etc. We have many genes involved in many traits. The relation is a many-to-many one. We have pleiotropic genes and polygenic traits, which means genes affecting more than one traits and traits being affected by more than one genes. And nowadays, we can find statistical associations between specific sites on DNA and specific diseases or traits. And this has given rise to what I describe in my book as the associated gene. The problem is that finding a statistical association doesn't necessarily mean that there is a cause-effect relation. What the scientists do in these studies, they separate healthy people from patients, and they look for different frequencies of one or the other SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms in them. And once they find, they look more closely into the ones that have found to have some association. But the truth is that insofar as we reveal the underlying biological mechanism, this is not very helpful, because an association between genes and a condition can be because these genes directly affect it, they're implicated in their development, or because one gene affects the other, which in turn affects the condition, or because both genes affect the third gene we don't yet know that affects the condition. So in all these cases, we can have associations, and until we understand what is going on, we cannot know if this is a statistical outcome or a real cause and effect relationship. This does not mean that we should ignore them. It just means that association does not necessarily entail causation. So if we ask what are genes, we can say that gene is a DNA sequence or a unit of DNA sequences that encode information for the production of functional molecules. They can be RNA or proteins. And we should know that the information that genes carry is not inherent. It is in constant interaction with whatever happens in the cell and around cells. So what genes can do is that encode this information for the production of molecules which are implicated in the development of characters and account for phenotypic variation in particular populations. So returning to sex and the biological sex and how it is determined, well, there are many proteins involved in that, and this is this SRY that the author of that book mentioned. Yes, that's an important protein that can turn an initially undifferentiated gonad to a testis, but it's not the only one, as you can see. Many of these proteins can make a difference during development. So if we want to understand what genes do, here's a simple metaphor that we can use. When we have the DNA in the same way we have a recipe book, having the book is not enough, because as you can see here, we can have two different chefs who may interpret this recipe differently. So the same DNA in two different developmental systems can lead to a very different outcome. In that case, a very different phenotype. And I have empirical evidence for both the outcome on the left and the outcome on the right. So knowing the DNA alone is not enough, because whatever DNA does, it happens during our development, and we need to be aware of the context in which development happens. Another metaphor is by Louis Wolpert about the origami. So genes cannot tell us how an organism will look, but rather like an origami, how we can make an organism. But development is not only about genes, it also has to do with interactions among cells and everything that happens. Most importantly, if we want to think about genes and environment, it is a mistake to think of genes and environment contributing independently, as these two children do here, pouring water in the bucket. We cannot separate the contributions of genes and environment, because they're both necessary. As you can see on the right, we need both of these kids to pour water in the bucket, and in the same sense, we need both genes and environment to have a phenotypic outcome. There is an interaction among them, and whereas we can statistically separate their contribution in populations, we cannot do that for individuals. But because we can make this distinction, we sometimes misinterpret the roles. For instance, we may ask why there is snow in the North Pole, and the answer would be that there are low temperatures and high humidity. And then we may ask why there's no snow in the South Pole, and the answer could be that even though we have low temperatures, there's low humidity. This does not allow us to say that humidity is the cause of snow in the North Pole, because low temperatures are also important. Humidity is what makes the difference, and this is sometimes what genes do. They make a difference, but they're not the only cause, they're not the only condition for the outcomes we observe. So, to reach some conclusions, and then I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. A take-home message from this discussion is that evolution is not purposeful. Evolution depends on contingencies, is very unpredictable, has a long history, and whatever we see is the outcome of this history. Also, evolution is not inherently atheistic. You can draw conclusions for your religious belief, whatever you want, but the theory itself does not show that God exists or does not exist. This is not a scientific question or something that we can test from the scientific perspective. Each person can believe whatever they want. Returning to genes, genes are not all powerful, they're important, but in a complex relationship with one another and with the proximate environment of cells and the broader environment of organisms. And they're not the essences of who we are, because whatever they do depends on many other factors. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.